From the Sports Madness studio in San Antonio, Texas, you are in the Madhouse. This is Sports Madness, and I am your host, David Vaughn. I want to welcome everyone onto the Sports Madness Network here on YouTube. Thank you so much for joining us today. This is episode 9 of Sports Madness. We are so glad that you're joining us today, and today we have a very special guest in the house. We're joined today in the Madhouse by a good friend of mine, Mr. Jake Bowtell. Jake is the host of the Chaps Chat Cats crew, or one of 3 hosts of the Chaps Chat Cat podcast that is part of the Hoops Crew network there in Australia. Jake, how are you today? How are things going? And you're kind of wrapping up your summer over there, so how are things going out there for you?
Yeah, I'm great. Thanks for having me on. It's a pleasure to be here. It feels fitting that I'm in the Madhouse. I think that fits with my personality. So yeah, no, really glad to be here. Summer, it's probably at its hottest right now. I just went down to the oceanside city of Geelong on the weekend for a cycling event, and it was hot. It was, I think, 40 degrees Celsius on the Sunday, so lots of sunscreen, lots of shade, lots of gelato on the sidelines as we watch some of the world's best cyclists go around. So no, it's nice and hot. I'm ready for it to cool down a bit, and yeah, a pleasure to be here.
So for our friends that don't work in Celsius, that equates to about 105 degrees Fahrenheit. That is a hot day. You also got to check out some cricket while you were down there. Yes, was that?
Yeah,
my understanding correct?
We had a whole sports weekend. Friday, myself and my wife, we went down to the Melbourne Cricket Ground, which is, for anyone who doesn't know, I think it's the biggest stadium in Australia, definitely the biggest stadium in the state of Victoria where I live, 100,000 plus seating capacity. And we watched the second day of the women's Ashes cricket match. Again, if you're not from Australia, you might not know what the heck I'm talking about. The women's Ashes is a contest played between Australia and England. And yeah, so we went and watched a day of that. It was really good. We watched Annabelle Sutherland make 164 runs. She was the first woman to score a test match 100 at the MCG in history. So her name goes on the honour board there at the MCG Cricket Ground, which is pretty special to have your name up there.
And I know on the men's side, the Ashes are pretty hotly contested. As I understand, on the women's side, it's a very one-sided affair. Is this correct?
It was this year, yeah. The English didn't win a match, so we played 7 games against them, and Australia won 7-0. So we're very happy with that. England are very unhappy with that. We've got the men's version coming next summer, so hopefully we can repeat the dose.
All right, well, that would be awesome. That sounds like a good time, and I'm going to try and check some of that out, actually, because we can watch those matches over here, actually. So I think I'm going to try and check some of that out. Well, the reason I've got you on today is we're going to talk some Australian rules football, which is really right in the middle of your wheelhouse. So first of all, Jake, for those that are not necessarily familiar, Australian rules football. You introduced me to the sport about 4 years ago, and I fell in love with it immediately. It quickly became my favorite sport overall. And I still remember my very, very first match that I ever saw was between the Geelong Cats and the West Coast Suns. It was Joel Selwood's 300th match. It was Gary Ablett Jr.'s 350th match. And I remember a young player on West Coast as well who it was off to a promising season, but his season ended. A young man by the name of Matt Rowell, it got pretty severely hurt in the game and kind of wrapped it up. But I thought, and I think a lot of people that are not familiar with it also thought that Australian rules football was rugby, and it is in fact not. Would you mind explaining for our viewers that don't necessarily know what Australian rules football is and why we would care about it here in the U.S.?
Absolutely. And I'll say, in addition to my description, go on YouTube and type in Nim Explains or Nin Explains Aussie Rules Football. He's a great YouTube channel. He explains all sorts of sports, hundreds of sports from around the globe. He does a great description with video accompaniment, but I will give it a crack. So basically, Australian rules football is played on cricket grounds, essentially. So big circular fields. It's 18 players aside on the field, so 36 players on the field at any one time. Multiple umpires. We won't even get into NFL fans will know what it's like to have a game of football, full of umpires and referees. So 18 aside, you have 4 on the bench, so 22 players in total, and generally an injury sub. But the game is basically played at a high speed. It's a very free-flowing game. Anyone who's ever watched a sport like Gaelic football or hurling, perhaps, it's that sort of end-to-end ebb and flow, very physical. It's a full contact sport. There's no pads, there's no helmets, just a lot of guys, or now women as well, in the AFLW, in shorts and sleeveless shirts, going hell for leather, tackling, bumping, all that sort of stuff. So primarily the ball is moved by foot, but also by hand. You can give a hand pass which is with a closed fist, and sort of punch the footy to a teammate. Scoring, there's 4 goalposts. This is where the game may be confusing to people. There's 4 posts. There's 2 large posts in the middle, which are the goalposts, and outside of those are 2 smaller posts called the behind posts. You get the ball off the foot without being touched by an opponent, so the ball cannot be touched by an opponent. If it goes through cleanly through the goals, you get 6 points. If it goes either side of the goalpost, you get 1 point. Games go for roughly 2 hours, I would say. It changes a bit depending on how much stoppage there is in the game, but generally 2 hours. It's 4 quarters. So yeah, that's basically it. I think it's the characteristics of it for me that I think are appealing to Australian audiences, and why I think it's really should be appealing to American audiences as well, is that it's fast, it's hard fought, it's played at a furious pace, it's highly skilled. I would say they are probably some of the fittest athletes on the planet. The level of running they do across the game, as well as their tackling and that sort of thing, I think they would be up there as some of the fittest athletes on the planet. So yeah, I think it's just a great spectacle to watch.
And I actually have a daughter that plays Australian rules football here in the United States, and her goal is actually to play in the AFL Women's League. And she describes it as a combination between football, soccer, hockey, and basketball and volleyball. She says, just take it all, combine it all, and there you go. It's a very, very entertaining sport, and something that I didn't realize, the Australian Football League, or AFL, was founded in 1897. And it is much older than American football, and is the sport where American football actually got its origins. And so, although it doesn't really resemble all that much the American game, it is a sport that there are elements of it that you would recognize. But it's a sport that it's a lot of fun. Like I said, I had heard of it, but didn't know what it was. Like I said, until you introduced me to it back in 2020, and I got in, and that was actually how I really got to know you and your family and friends, and it was a lot of fun. The broom came to be in that season. It ended up being a good thing. So
yeah.
So yeah, it was a lot of fun. It's a great sport, and yeah, I would encourage you to like he said, look up Nim Explains Australian Rules Football, or just go on and look up like AFL game highlights, and that'll hook you in quicker than anything. So talk to me a little bit about the league, the state of the league, the AFL-M and the AFLW side. If you don't mind, just kind of talk about what, how the league is going, how it's progressing, any expansion plans, things like that.
Yeah. So basically, I'll give you a really like abbreviated sort of history of the league. As you said, 1870. Well, 1870s is when we started to have leagues formed. For a long time, it was the Victorian Football League was the main one, the state that I live in, and then it slowly expanded to be an interstate competition. And by the early 2000s, we had teams in all states, not all territories though, in Australia, but all the main states. And to the point now, we have 18 teams in the men's, and we now have 18 teams in the women's as well. The women's league only started in 2017, started out with 8 teams, and it's already expanded to have the full 18. So there's been a big push with that for the AFL to get an equal billing in terms of the amount of teams fielded for men and women. So the way, and there's plans too, I should say, to expand to include a Tasmanian team, I think by 2028, off the top of my head. So they will be a 19th team, and if I know anything, it'll be that we'll end up with a 20th team as well. I don't think they'll want to leave the league with an odd number of teams. They'll eventually expand to a 20th team, and there's a bit of debate about where and what that will be. But all of that is just conjecture at this point. So very, very exciting. Tasmania is a footy-loving place that, while it's small in population, they've been really actively pursuing having an AFL club for a long time. So they will get a men's and a women's team. As I said, I think it might be like 2028-ish that they're going to come on board. So yeah, right now, 18 teams in each. The way it works is you play. The men last season played 23 home and away games. The women's season is a lot fewer than that. They only play 11 matches home and away at the moment. I'm a big fan of expanding that. So essentially, you don't play everyone twice. You play some teams twice. You play some teams once. It's a bit like the NFL. It's always a little bit of a mix-up. Season to season with the fixture. It's not like the English Premier League or something where you play everyone twice. You play your sort of 22, 23 games. You get 4 points for a win, 2 points for a draw, no points for a loss. And we have a ladder or a table or standings, if that's the right terminology for you guys. And the top 8 teams at the end of the season, they qualify for what we call finals, what you would call playoffs. And so that's basically a process of elimination from there. It's a big advantage to finish in the top 4 because you actually get a double chance. You can afford to lose your first game of the finals and you're still alive. So almost invariably the team that wins the premiership, which is our version of a championship, they generally come from the top 4. It's very rare to have a team come from outside of that. Though it does happen. It does happen. So did you want me to talk a little bit about last season and how that all unfolded?
Please, yeah, that would be great.
Yeah. So last season was an interesting one. It was a strange year. I'll say it that way. We sort of had. I'm just trying to bring up this ladder here. That's right. So we actually had a team from outside the top 4 win the premiership, the Brisbane Lions. The Lions were a real force in the early 2000s for anyone. It might have been a name you heard if you were sort of into footy, even internationally in the early 2000s. You probably heard about the Brisbane Lions. They won 3 premierships in a row, 2001, 2002, 2003, and were going for a 4th in 2004, but were beaten in the grand final by Port Adelaide. So I think they would have become the first ever team to win 4 in a row had they done that. But in the meantime, they sort of went through some troughs. They went downhill, a lot of changing, of personnel and coaching and that sort of thing. But they've been resurgent the last, probably half decade, and they capitalized big time. They missed the top 4. They finished 5th on the standings and made a great run in the finals. They beat Carlton 99-71 in their first game, had a massive comeback win over the Greater Western Sydney Giants, 105-100. And then sadly for me, they beat my Geelong Cats in the preliminary final, 95-85. It was honestly like one of the games of the season, Geelong v Brisbane, despite my team losing. It was a remarkable game, a great advertisement for the sport and what it can be. And then they demolished the Sydney Swans in the grand final. It was an absolute flogging. They won 120-60. So, yeah, Brisbane are the current reigning men's champions, very much deserving and a highly talented team. So, yeah, that's how last season played out. Brisbane winning from fifth.
Now, I'm just going to interject this in here because it kind of makes me smile a little bit. Now, this is not the first time in recent history that Sydney have been absolutely destroyed in the grand final, correct?
Correct. The Sydney Swans are one of the most consistent teams in the whole AFL in the 21st century. They've won 2 premierships. Let me make sure I've got that right off. Yes, two in the 21st century, but they've made a lot more grand finals than that. However, recent history, they've had a bit of a track record of making it to the big game and then getting hammered. And yeah, as you alluded to, in 2022, it was our Geelong Cats who, gave them an absolute spanking by 80 odd points. But that's been the track record. And after this latest defeat, their coach actually stepped aside, which was sort of surprising, but maybe not. I wasn't sure whether to be surprised or not about it, to be honest. He's obviously feeling maybe that the team needs a new voice, a new approach to these big games, because they keep getting there and then coming up well and truly short on the day.
And so like with the AFL, the league obviously is primarily Australian players, and there's a number of Indigenous players. Would you mind kind of talking a little bit about like some of the more famous Indigenous players and really their contributions to the league as a whole?
Yeah, absolutely. So, Indigenous Australians have made a massive contribution to the game. There's some sort of conjecture about whether their game of, I believe it's called Marngrook, actually helped influence the development of Australian rules football, way back when the sport was just being formed. So it's not just a modern day thing. There's a long-standing interweaving, I guess, with the culture of the sport. And today, like, there's a number of brilliant Indigenous players right across the league. Tyson Stengel being one who plays for Geelong, an extremely exciting small goal-kicking forward. He's just a highly creative player. That's sort of the definition of a small forward in Australian rules football. They're generally high pressure players in that they apply a lot of tackles in the forward line, or they are creative. They have vision. They can set other people up to score goals. They can score incredibly artistic goals themselves. Goals from angles that others wouldn't dream of. I'm going to talk about another cat, Lawson Humphreys. Another Indigenous player. Both of these guys have just been selected to the 2025 Indigenous All-Stars team that's going to play the Fremantle Dockers. I can't remember when that game is, but it's sort of an exhibition match. Lawson Humphreys.
It's in less than 2 weeks. It's coming up.
Yeah, so that'll be a brilliant one to watch, and will expose people to a lot of different names. But Lawson Humphreys burst onto the scene last year at Geelong. He was one of the first. It was his first season. He played a lot of time in our reserves side, and then made it up into the firsts, the AFL team. And once he was there, he never relinquished his position. His sense of, he's to sort of compare him, I suppose, the position he plays to an NFL position. Maybe it's something a little bit like safety or cornerback. He's kind of a smaller statured player, but he reads the game incredibly well. So he's often intercepting kicks and possessions down in the back line. But then his ability, and I suppose this is something where footy, differs to the NFL, is that once he makes that interception, we're then instantly on attack, and he's setting up, offensive plays. And something that stands out about Lawson Humphreys is I don't know which is his natural kicking foot, because he kicks equally well off the left or the right. You really can't tell. So they're two players amongst the Geelong Cats that are definitely worth watching. But then right across the competition, Kysaiah Pickett for Melbourne is an absolutely dynamic player to watch. Jamara Ugle-Hagan for the Western Bulldogs. You could really go on and on in terms of, fantastic Indigenous players to watch.
And, there's even an American in the league. I think there's just one, but there is an American in the league, and he's actually kind of one of the league darlings. Like, he's kind of one of the faces of the league. Would you mind talking about Mason Cox a little bit?
Absolutely. Mason Cox is a really interesting player. And I think he actually highlights his presence in the league, highlights, what would you say? Like, I don't know if it's a cultural difference or something. Like, he definitely gets under the skin, I'll say this, of a lot of Aussie Rules fans. He's an extremely prominent player, but he has a unique ability to wind up Australian footy fans. He plays for Collingwood. He's a ruckman. So ruckman essentially trying to work. This would probably be part of the volleyball comparison that your daughter is talking about, where essentially at the start of the game, the teams all line up and you have each side has a ruckman. They're generally the tallest player on the field for their respective sides. They go head to head in a contest. The umpire throws the ball up and they both jump into the air to try and smash it down with their fist into the advantage of their teammate. And they sort of do that on a lot of restarts around the ground as the game unfolds. And that's the primary job of a ruckman, is to win hitouts in advantage of their team. Mason Cox has sort of chiseled out this career at the Collingwood Magpies. He's had a lot of ups and downs. There's been times where, he's been woefully out of form and out of the side. And then, he comes back in and plays, a handful of incredible games. So he's a very hot and cold player. And I think that too is part of what drives some of this interaction with the crowd, is that when he's up and about and playing well, he's verbally up and about. He's taking shots at other players, taking shots at, at fans and stuff, and talking a lot of crap. So then the fans give it back to him the moment he drops off. But he's the first American to win a premiership in the AFL. So I'd have to check whether there's been a female US player who's won a premiership in the women's. But I know he's definitely the first American man to win a premiership, and of course from OSU. So I know you've followed his progress keenly.
Yeah, he had, for those who don't know, he was actually he played basketball at Oklahoma State. Mason Cox, he was actually listed as 7'1" when he was in college. He's not, but I think he is every bit of 7 feet. If not, he's very, very close. If he's tall, he's kind of remarkably fast for a big guy. He does get up and down the pitch all right. If I watch him, and unfortunately he plays for the bad guys, and that's it's just like I'm not a huge Collingwood fan, but I do kind of follow Mason Cox a little bit. And a little interesting bit. He recently applied for and earned Australian citizenship. He now holds dual citizenship with Australia and the United States. But a lot of times whenever he would score a goal or make a big play, the crowd would erupt in USA chants, like you would hear like at an American Olympic event. It's kind of interesting to hear Australian fans chanting USA over here on this side of the pond.
Yeah, and I'll say that I should add too that I think part of the reason he's sometimes seen as a bit of a villain for some fan bases is that he plays for Collingwood. Collingwood are, if I was going to give an example, an NFL parallel, they're sort of the Dallas Cowboys in some ways. It's hard because the Cowboys haven't really been particularly relevant for like 30 years, but Collingwood certainly have. But Collingwood bill themselves as like, this isn't the wording they use, but it's the word I use, like Australia's team. They view themselves as the biggest brand, the biggest club, the biggest team, the biggest supporter base. So they're extremely brash. They're extremely annoying, but it is good when they're up and about because Geelong often beats them. I think we're 5-2 in finals against them in the 21st century. So I'm always happy for them to be up and about because Geelong has a good track record of going into their home stadium and putting a whipping on them. That's kind of a bit of an AFL NFL parallel, I would say. I've always thought there's something a bit Dallas Cowboys about the way Collingwood struts their stuff.
Right, they are kind of the brand for Australian rules football, and like when I was first introduced to them, aside from you, any research that I did always kind of highlighted them. And so, I kind of recognized them immediately as like, okay, they're the brand.
Yeah.
So let's kind of bring it in a little bit more. Let's talk about the Geelong Cats, that's the team that you cover on your podcast. And so let's talk about the Geelong Cats and maybe kind of their history, bringing it into the present. I do know, like, here's what I know. And again, I'm admittedly new to Australian rules football, but I know I heard, I'm pretty sure it was Brian Taylor was talking about that. I guess they've been in the premiership final preliminary final, which is their conference championship, the equivalent of their conference championship. Is it 15 of the last 19 years or something absurd like that?
Yeah. Like, again, if we go to NFL, AFL comparisons, I mean, it would be easy to draw a New England Patriots to Geelong Cats sort of line. I say Collingwood is one of my least favorite teams, but I think if you ask 17 of the other 18 fan bases, a lot of people are very much sick of Geelong. So Geelong of the 90s. So just as a bit of history, the Cats are the second oldest AFL club, and we're believed to be the fourth oldest football club in Australia. And one of the oldest in the world. And the Cats, very successful in the early years of footy through to probably the 60s, sort of that early period through to the 1960s. And then it went really quiet for Geelong. They had a pretty rough go of it in the 1970s and the early part of the 80s. And then across late 80s, the 90s, they had a great run. They made 4 grand finals in, I think, about 6 years or 7 years, and they lost all of them. They were a bit like the Buffalo Bills of the 90s. They would make the big dance, and then they would get beaten. And so for me, growing up, I was born in 1990, so I really started watching footy, conscientiously and observantly probably in the early 2000s. The reputation Geelong had were they're the chokers. It's a classic old Geelong was kind of the saying. They make the finals and then they choke out. They go to the grand final. They get beaten by the actual teams. And so that was sort of the reputation I had, they had. We hadn't won a premiership in over 40 years. It was one of the longest active droughts. And then in 2007, they broke through. They produced probably one of the better seasons of footy I've ever watched. The highest ever winning margin in a grand final. They beat Port Adelaide by 119 points. And that really kicked off an unrivaled 21st century of dominance. No one has won more games than Geelong. They've won 4 premierships from 6 visits. So, essentially, 4 Super Bowls from 6 attempts. And they are pretty much in the Final Four every single season. I think we've missed finals twice, 2 or 3 times since 2007. They are a perennial powerhouse, and yeah, that's probably the best way to paint Geelong. They are a thorn in everyone else's side, because, as you would know, in the NFL, the expectation is that teams ebb and flow. You cycle up for a few years, you have go at winning a championship, then you cycle back down. Geelong have essentially for 2 decades defied the gravity of the AFL, and everyone's well and truly sick of them doing so.
Well, not everyone.
Not everyone, not us.
Right. So let's look a little bit at kind of the leaders of the team currently, and what your expectations are of the Cats and of the league as a whole for the upcoming season, which is about 6 weeks away from really, really, truly kicking off.
Yeah. Well, I'll start with the league as a whole. I think teams like Collingwood. So Collingwood won the premiership in 2023. They missed finals last year, but I think they'll be right back there at the pointy end, to be honest. I think they're well coached. They've got a great home ground. They've got great support. So they're a side that once they get on a roll, it's very hard to stop them. They're sort of a momentum club. Once they string a few wins together, that home crowd gets louder and louder and bigger. So I think Collingwood will be right there. Again, I'm interested with Brisbane to see whether they can repeat what they did last year. They've lost a couple of key players, but their run in the finals also produced some of their best footy from some of their young stars. So I think they are in a position where they can probably go back and compete. The Western Bulldogs are a fascinating team. They finished 6th last year. They are a side that are stacked with talent every single season, particularly the last decade. And unfortunately, probably just haven't capitalized as often as they would have liked to. They won a drought-breaking premiership back in 2016, and they actually got back to the grand final again in 2021 and lost it. They're a team that probably at times they've played below the sum of their parts, or they could. There's a lot more potential in that side. That if they unlock it, they could be an extremely scary proposition.
Well, and didn't one of their primary players just end up being traded to Geelong?
Yeah, well, this is another reason a lot of people hate Geelong, is because we have a habit of nicking some of the best players from around the league. We're a very attractive free agency destination. We have a habit of, I guess, players requesting trades to Geelong for a number of reasons. So, I mean, part of it is that we win all the time. So players who might be frustrated at a current post see Geelong as a ticket to competing at the pointy end. I think, Bailey Smith of the Western Bulldogs is an extremely promising young midfielder. He's joined Geelong this off-season. I think it was just a case of he probably needed a fresh start. He'd had a few injury issues. So I think he was just ready for a fresh start. And that's why the trade in team. So, yeah, there's some teams I think will be really promising. I think we'll see some drop-off. I think Sydney and Port Adelaide, they finished 1st and 2nd on the ladder. I don't personally think they'll finish that high again. I think there's a possibility that one or both of those could fall down to the bottom of the 8 or even miss finals. And look, it's really hard from the 10 teams that missed finals last year. I'd be saying Collingwood could. I think, as I said, Collingwood will make a charge, but then I don't know out of the rest. It's interesting. The Adelaide Crows have threatened year after year to get back to the glory days they had in the mid to late 90s, but they've underwhelmed repeatedly. So I just don't know there. So Geelong, my expectations are, as they always are, basically make finals, make playoffs. That's the minimum bar required to get a tick from me. I think there's no reason. I think if anything, our list, our roster has got stronger, and this is a team that won a flag, won a premiership. So that's what we call it, a flag as well. It's a premiership or a flag, just for anyone listening. I know I've used the terms interchangeably, but we won a premiership in 2022. We were back to a prelim final, so essentially conference championship equivalent last season, and the list is actually getting stronger. Our squad of players is getting stronger. So, yeah, I think make the top 8 is a minimum requirement, and I think we can push a lot higher and finish top 4 again. And the players, the key players I'm looking for Geelong, Tom Stewart. He's an absolute gun defender, one of the most ferocious players on a footy field. He actually played a lot of time in midfield last year and showed that he could do that as well when we needed. So he's a player that Geelong need, fit and firing. He's the vice captain. Our captain, Patrick Dangerfield, getting towards the end of his career. So I'll expect for him to be managed a bit. I'd be stunned if he played every game. Geelong will put him on a bit of a health management plan of, maybe he'll play 15 or 16 games out of the 20 odd, I would expect. And you've got to give his body time to recover during the season. He's one of the most explosive players in the whole league, but is, as I said, reaching the end of his career. And then you look at the youth, I would say Max Holmes is a player for Geelong. He's an absolute speedster. He can play sort of defense or midfield, or out on the wing. He can play a variety of positions, but he sort of is the future for Geelong. And we need him to step in and play really well, which he has been doing. And then finally, I'd just say the key piece is probably Jeremy Cameron. I think Jeremy Cameron, he's one of the best forwards in the league in the 21st century, I would say. Definitely one of the best Cats forwards of the 21st century. And to me, Jeremy Cameron is the Jenga piece for Geelong. If you take him out, he's probably the hardest player for us to cover. We've had Tom Hawkins, who is a legendary full forward. He retired last year. So it was Hawkins and Cameron for a long time. Now we've got Cameron and Shannon Neal. And Shannon Neal is about, I think he's 21 or 22. So he's just starting out. Jeremy Cameron, there's a lot on him now. He's the spearhead of that Cats attack. So, yeah, he is a player. He must stay healthy. He must be in form. Because, yeah, as I said, I think he's the Jenga piece. If you pull him out, it's going to be very hard for the Cats to cover him.
Who, in your opinion, because I have someone specific in mind, and I'll throw mine out there, but I want to hear yours first. Who is it, in your opinion, that's kind of the X factor for Geelong, that if this player is on, they're going to be successful, and if he's not, they probably won't be? And maybe not a Jeremy Cameron type. Mine is Mark Blixovs.
Yep.
Because he does everything, and a lot of people don't know Mark Blixovs is actually an Olympic track runner. He was steeplechase, yes? Was that what he did?
Yeah, he did steeplechase before footy, yeah.
So, yeah, no, Mark Blixovs is kind of the guy. He's big. He'll body people around. And, again, kind of one of those remarkably quick for his size. But when he's out, you notice it. And he's another one like Jeremy Cameron that's just impossible to cover, even with two people. You can't really make up what he brings to the table. And kind of
Mark Blixovs, 100%. 100%. Mark Blixovs, in an NFL comparison, it's sort of like a player that, you could line him up at tight end. He could also play cornerback. He could also go and play some, receiver. He could even play a little bit of safety if you really needed him to. He's super dynamic, a very tall athlete, but extremely athletic as well. So, he's kind of at times been a bit of a matchup nightmare for opposing coaches because Geelong use him. And this gets back to that Geelong New England Patriots comparison. Belichick and the Patriots always used to love their sort of almost positionless players. We can play this person anywhere. We can have linebackers that can go out and play corner or safety, and we can, have, whatever. It's kind of like the Cats. The Cats love to sort of mix and match, and you'll sometimes have Jeremy Cameron, who's a, huge full forward. He'll go out and play on the wing. And yeah, Geelong love mixing that up. So an X factor player for me. Look, honestly, I find it hard to go past Max Holmes. Max Holmes is the future at Geelong, and we saw, I think, last year his injury in the prelim final, which is the second time in 3 years that he has had a season-ending injury in the prelim final. So it's the equivalent of going to your conference championship game and then doing your ACL. So he missed a premiership win in 2022. Last year he went down injured around halftime in the game. Thereafter, Brisbane really got back into it and took control. I think he's crucial. His speed and explosiveness, particularly if we're trying to give Dangerfield a little bit of a spell or a rest. Max Holmes is a player who's coming into the absolute height of his powers. And there were games last year where, when Geelong did struggle. I mean, we only lost, I think, 7 games in total last year. But in those games where we struggled, he was still a player that had exceptionally good games. So he's not dictated. He's not a player that rises to the temperature of others. He's the player that sets a temperature for others to rise to, is what I would say about Max Holmes. So yeah, we have to have him up and firing.
I think that's actually a really good assessment of Max Holmes. And like you said, I mean, he's young. I mean, he's a piece that you're going to be able to build around for a long time. And if the Cats are able to keep their roster in place, they're not going to be dropping off anytime soon. It's like they'll lose a legend, but they pick up another legend, and they just kind of keep cycling and keep circling through. Real quick before we move on to our final point, it's way too early to tell. We haven't seen anybody inform or anything. Just your gut. Give me your top 4 for the finals for this year.
I'll do it in no particular order, but I'll just select the 4 teams that I think will go top. I think it'll be Geelong. I think it will be who else did I have in it? Collingwood. I think Geelong, Collingwood, as much as it pains me to say, Hawthorn, and I'm going to go the Western Bulldogs. I think those 4 teams. I think the Dogs will get their stuff together, and I think that'll be a top 4: Geelong, Collingwood, Hawthorn, and the Dogs.
And I'll say this for the Hawthorn Hawks. First of all, they're like the biggest arch rival of the Cats. I believe your co-host lovingly referred to them as the scum. So there's certainly no love lost there. But I feel like they kind of did a Washington Commanders this year. They really kind of came out of nowhere and had a shockingly good year.
Yeah, that's spot on comparison. They started the year actually terribly. There was a lot of talk that they were doing sort of a roster overhaul. We're just going to play our young players, develop them. They were getting trounced. I can't remember if they started 0-4 or something like that. They just lost most of the opening month and a half. Their opening 5 games, they lost, and then went on a run to make finals, and play really well in the finals as well. So yeah, as I said, I don't like them. There's a history between Geelong and Hawthorn that makes it very hard for me to appreciate anything good that they do. But the Washington Commanders is a great comparison in terms of that rise from rags to riches for them last year.
Right. Well, and I think, just kind of hanging on this story just a little bit. I mean, what they kind of had to overcome to even have that happen was pretty remarkable too. I mean, they had like some serious issues, like major allegations of racism, was it not, that were going through the
yeah.
I know it was a big story in the league.
It's definitely, yeah. Look, it's definitely worth a Google rabbit hole if you want to read about all that sort of stuff. If you want to look into it, I think it's all sort of been closed up now. But plenty of news reporting out there on it. There's a number of reasons I don't particularly like the Hawthorn Football Club, but to their credit, if I take off my Geelong glasses, if I was a neutral, they would have been an easy team to cheer for last year because they played an exciting brand of footy. I can through gritted teeth appreciate that.
Right. And then like one final one before we get into your podcast and what you guys are doing. Why can't North Melbourne pull it together?
Oh, it's a great question. And would be so shocking, for if you'd got in a time machine at the end of, sort of the 90s and then transported yourself to the year 2025, and you would be stunned at the difference between what North Melbourne were and what North Melbourne are. They're another club that illustrates how difficult it is to do what teams like Geelong and Sydney, and to an extent Hawthorn and Brisbane, have been able to do, which is remain eternally competitive. And look, I think it's one of those hard things. It's a vicious cycle. North Melbourne have been losing for a long time. And so it becomes harder and harder to win. The longer you lose, the more, you forget how to close out games, the more you forget how to put together winning performances. And I think it's a lesson in team management. I am pretty critical of the way that they booted a few legends out the door, probably a season or two early, maybe 8 or 9 years ago. And that pretty much coincided with them going downhill in a really significant way. And it's why I always champion teams like Geelong hanging on to their older players maybe longer than other teams would, because those players become coaches on the field. And that's how Geelong can develop talent that's drafted lower in the process, that might not have that innate, that first round draft talent. They've got players who understand how to win and maintain a standard of winning around them. So I think that we'll see. It's a crucial year for North. That's what I'll say. It's a very crucial year for North Melbourne. If they don't turn it around, they've hired a former Hawthorn premiership winning coach, Alistair Clarkson. I think this is his 3rd year in charge, and things haven't been greatly improved. So it's a big year for them, because this stuff can stretch on and on and on.
Right. And I mean, at that level, winning is hard anytime. But it is, if you don't know how to win, it becomes much harder.
And then you have, and the thing is too, I think once upon a time, like free agency only came into the AFL, just for people, I think around 2012. So, the ability for players to become free agents and player movement. I mean, you're seeing it in the NFL. Obviously, you guys had free agency earlier than we did, but you're seeing this player empowerment movement happening in all sports, And so what you now have in the AFL, once upon a time, you would have drafted all your young talent. If you were a team that had a few years, down the bottom of the table, you get all these high draft picks, you draft them in, you put them in the team, they play a bunch of seasons, and then they're sort of battle hardened and they're ready to go out and compete again. But they have to suffer through all this losing because they can't leave clubs as easily. Now that free agency is a thing, now that sort of an ease of player movement has come about, sides like North Melbourne or the Gold Coast Suns, for example, they draft high-end talent because they pick high in the draft. 2 years into their contract, the young talent are miserable and they want to leave, and they can leave. So it's why Geelong can poach these players. It's why Sydney's and the Collingwoods can poach players, because there's that freedom of movement, and you're no longer chained to a club that can't win. So I think that has been a big part of it, is that players get sick of it. You've got to find a way to turn it around and be an environment that players want to be in.
Yeah, I mean that's so big, and it's big everywhere. So let's turn the corner a little bit. We're going to talk about your podcast, the Chaps Chat Cats. I've been a big fan of it since its inception. I'm one of the ones that was there at the very beginning of it. I remember actually when you bounced the idea off of me, and I had the unique and pretty cool privilege of actually writing your theme music, and that was a lot of fun. I actually just went back the other day and listened to that just because I was like, this is the most ridiculous. And if you're not familiar with this podcast, the theme song it's the most ridiculous song you've ever heard in your life. It's so dumb. But they said they wanted something like that, so here we go. But yeah, so talk to me about the Chaps Chat Cats, where it came from, where it is now, where you see it going, and then kind of talk about some of the newer partnerships that you have with it.
So yeah, I mean, one of the more ridiculous theme songs, probably one of the more ridiculous podcasts, really. So it started off during COVID, the COVID times, COVID lockdowns. We were all watching games. Myself and my two co-hosts, my brother Sam and my brother from another mother, Johnny, we were watching games in our own houses, but jumping on a Zoom call and chatting as the game would unfold. And then we found we were sticking around, 35, 45, 60 minutes after, with our thoughts on the game. And then at a certain point we should start recording these and putting them up. So that's where it really came from. So we started our first season in 2021. We actually started with the women's season before the men's. And yeah, from there we've done over well in excess of 300 episodes. Started off once a week. At times we've done 2 or 3 episodes a week. And it's just sort of grown from there. And last year was our first year in partnership with a couple of guys, Ben and Paul, who are also doing really awesome Cats coverage on YouTube. And so, yeah, we've basically come together to form the Hoops crew. Now, the Hoops, for anyone who doesn't know, Geelong wear a hooped jersey. So if you think about, teams like Celtic FC, the green and white bands running horizontally, Geelong is like this navy blue and white hoops. So the Hoops is a big sort of Geelong thing. So we are the Hoops crew media network. And look, I think you'd be pretty hard pressed to find better, more regular, independent fan coverage of the Geelong Cats, to be completely honest. I don't not to try and pump up our own tires, but during the season, it's almost a show a day, really, between what we do on the Chaps and what Ben and Paul do. And it's just grown. We've got a really growing Patreon subscription base, which is great. I do basically scouting coverage of Geelong's secondary teams in the men and women's. So that's something that the Patreon subscribers get. Extended podcasts and all that sort of thing. But I think during the season we're going to be doing at least 5 episodes, 5 shows a week on the Hoops crew. A massive episode from us every Tuesday night on the Chaps. It'll be sort of an hour and a half, 2 hours on a Tuesday night. And then, lots of cool shows from Ben and Paul. And really excited. Last year was a great first year of partnership. And it's fun to be working with people who, might do things in a different way or take a different approach to producing what their analysis and their coverage. And it just inspires and motivates you to keep growing what you do.
It really is an enjoyable podcast for those of you that are maybe want to learn a little bit more about Australian rules football. I encourage you to check them out. Obviously, they're based for the Geelong Cats, so they're going to be kind of centric, like cat centric. But it is a good, knowledgeable podcast. It's a couple sets of good, like, people that do their homework, and it's not just empty information that you could just look up anywhere. These guys are good. They do their homework. Jake, I've taken up a lot of your time. Tell us do you have any projects in the offing that you're working on? Anything that any growth that you have planned? And we'll let you we'll write your discharge papers from the Madhouse.
Oh, no, fantastic. I've enjoyed being in the Madhouse. Happy to return anytime. It's always good to chat sport with you, mate. And so pleased to see you doing this. Speaking of projects, like it's great to hear you talking sports in front of a mic again. I think the world's a better place for it. Yeah, like so projects with the chaps where where as I've spoken about, it's sort of nearly daily coverage. We'd love more people to come over and watch on YouTube. We'd love more people to jump on the Patreon subscription. If you're a Cats fan or you want to become a Cats fan, like if you're new to the sport, become a Cats fan. It's a pretty good bet that you're going to get to see some good footy. So yeah, come on over, join the Patreon. We're trying to get up to 50 paid members this year. I think we're over halfway there. But yeah, it provides great coverage for you. It's good bang for your buck. And yeah, just personally, I'll just shout out, I'm doing a bit of cycling coverage over on my side hustle, the JBSE, the Jake Bowtell Sports Experience. So that's a podcast I've really enjoyed doing. It's still sort of finding its form and its feet, but yeah, I'm sort of keeping on doing that. So I'd love people to check that out as well. It's sort of it roams from interviews to recaps to previews to me just sitting in my front garden waffling on about a different issue or concept in sport. It's highly varied, but I'd love people to check it out.
It is like you're apt to hear anything on the JBSE, but no, it's always good. It's always entertaining. One final question, I'll let you out of here. Did you renew Colin's contract, or is he out of the picture now? Colin, your sound guy that you used to have on like early going.
Yeah, Colin had to be sent to sort of dry out this off season. So we're going to see how he comes back to the facility. Yeah, look, we invested heavily in Colin. He's been a massive disappointment at times. So we'll see heading into 2025. It's a big project. It's not just us anymore. It's the Hoops crew. We've impressed upon Colin the need to lift his game because there's a lot of people out there who'll do sound work, for nothing. We all know everyone wants to work voluntary hours. So, Colin's got to realize how lucky he is to be paid in, small amounts of Bitcoin.
Yes. I tell you what, I would settle for small amounts of Bitcoin at this point. Jake, thank you so much for coming into the Madhouse. I'm glad to have you as a friend of the show. I'm glad to have you as a friend in general. So I'm going to brag on you. The artwork that is behind you, those are pieces that Jake has drawn. Like that's hand-drawn art there behind him. You notice, obviously, the American football. You've got the Aussie rules, got the old leather helmets going on. And it's kind of a family tie. Your dad does art as well, and your brother also, correct? Does art also.
Yeah. Yeah, we like to draw a bit. We like to paint a bit. We do a bit of everything. A bit of filmmaking, a bit of podcasting, a bit of graphic art. Yeah, I don't know. I think we just we get bored easily doing the same thing all the time. Got to keep it varied.
Well, I think that's kind of human nature in general. But yeah, so
Yep.
Jake, we'll go ahead and let you get out here. Thank you so much for joining us today. I do want to thank all of you for joining us here on the Sports Madness Network here on YouTube. Until next time, this is David Vaughn along with Jake Bowtell, reminding you that there are good ships, wood ships, and ships that sail the seas, but the best ships are friendships. May they always be. Until next time, take care and God bless.